Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first Scholar Lecture. We're very excited to have you all with us. And before we get started, I'd just like to ask everyone to please keep yourself muted during the show. We're going to be asking for questions at the end of the lecture in the chat, so get ready for those and start brainstorming. I also wanted to let you know that we are recording this lecture and are going to be posting it on YouTube following the program, and the recording is also going to be adapted for our Seraphic Fire podcast coming out on October 3rd. So if you like this lecture, you can share it with your friends or just give it another listen later on. So thank you again for being here, and without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Patrick Quigley and Honey Meconi.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see all of you who are here tonight, and great to see Honey. Let me just start from the beginning. This is our first time doing this, so I actually have a script tonight. Go figure. So here we go. Hello and welcome. My name is Patrick Quigley. I'm the artistic director of Seraphic Fire, and this online lecture officially begins Seraphic Fire's 22nd season, titled Music History 101. This season, we are inaugurating a new set of collaborations with music scholars from some of America's top universities. Our collaborating scholars have consulted on the content of our programs, written articles, contributed program notes, and are participating in an online series of lectures. Seraphic Fire season opening concert, A Brief History of Western Music, will run from October 10 to 13. So this is, in fact, the very first of our lectures. Welcome to this experiment, and please give us the benefit of the doubt if anything strange happens with the tech tonight. Tonight, my guest and collaborating scholar is a recognizable presence to those of you who are familiar with Seraphic Fire's performances and recording of Hildegard of Bingen's Ordo Virtutum. Professor Honey Meconi is the inaugural Arthur Sachs Professor at the University of Rochester, where she is also Professor of Musicology at the Eastman School of Music. She is the founding editor of the monograph series Oxford Studies in Early Music for Oxford University Press. She is a specialist in music before 1600, and many of her publications include Hildegard of Bingen, the first English language book on Hildegard as a composer, Pierre de la Rue and Musical Life at the Habsburg Burgundian Court, and a continually expanding series of performing editions of Hildegard's music freely available online. So those of you who are choral nerds, please check it out. A lifelong performer, she is co-recipient of the American Musicological Society's Noah Greenberg Award for distinguished contribution to the study and performance of early music. Her public musicology blog, The Choral Singer's Companion, Music History with a Soupçon of Snark, is read worldwide. Honey, welcome back to Seraphic Fire.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It is absolutely thrilling to be here. I'm a longtime Seraphic Fire fan. Even before I heard a note of the music, I thought this is the best possible title for a performing ensemble. And I think I have all of your CDs. I love them all. And it's just a thrill to be able to be working with you again. Our Hildegard collaboration was a dream for me, and it resulted in the first complete recording of Hildegard's music drama, basically, Ordo Virtutum. I still think it's the best recording out there, and I would strongly encourage anyone who's not familiar with that to go download a copy now, purchase a hard copy. It's just an amazing, amazing thing. So, Patrick, I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm always happy to talk about the history of choral music.
We are so delighted to have you. And as said, our first collaboration was so much fun. And this year you've helped us put together all of these different scholars who are joining us. So not only are you our expert for two of our programs, but you are also the expert of experts, which is sort of fabulous. So, but let's jump into tonight's topic, which is a tongue-in-cheek titled A Brief History of Western Music. So tonight's presentation is about the evolution of Western music, but before we dive in, it's important to talk about the origins of group singing and just how ancient those roots are. So unlike other genres of what we think of as Western classical music, symphonic music, instrumental chamber music, opera, all of which have relatively modern origins, choral music really goes back to the foundations of civilization, I think, right? I mean,
absolutely. We know that there was choral music in ancient Greece, which is before the Common Era, but we also know there's choral music in the Old Testament in the Bible. So we're talking about something that can be documented back thousands of years, but it also seems, my guess is there was probably even choral music before then, simply because the voice is the original instrument. Singing together is a way of communicating. It's a way of building community. It is a very natural thing to do. So my guess is that it probably goes back even for millennia before we have the Old Testament. That would be but what I would think. But we really do have documentation of choral music for thousands and thousands of years, long before, as you said, operas, symphonies, chamber music, any of that stuff. Voice starts choral music. Yay.
yeah. So when we talk about Western classical music, we're talking about music that originated on the European continent and has its roots in a music tradition that began to be codified sometime after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Very specific, clearly. For reference, Christianity, which plays a large part in the evolution of classical music, became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire under the reign of Emperor Constantine. And in addition to elevating Christianity to the status of state religion, Constantine also moved the capital of the empire out of Rome to Constantinople, now Istanbul, in 330 in the Common Era. About a little under 150 years later, the final Western emperor, based in the city of Rome, is deposed by Germanic barbarians, and the Western Europe is plunged into a political and intellectual anarchy. And it is sometime between this moment and roughly the 9th century that the roots of what we think of as Western classical music begin to be codified. So, honey, what goes on at this point in history that leads to the development of a distinct musical tradition?
Well, first of all, when the Roman Empire falls apart in the 5th century, as you were saying, there has to be something to fill in that vacuum. And what filled in the vacuum was the Catholic Church. So even though politically Western Europe was a mess, the church itself was providing some sort of stabilizing force across Western Europe. As the centuries went by, what the area we think of as modern France began to coalesce into a kingdom. And the most important person in connection with that was the ruler we know as Charlemagne, or in Latin, Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, who by the time he was ruler, was in charge of a larger territory in Western Europe than anything since the fall of the Roman Empire. All of modern-day France, parts of modern-day Germany, Italy down to Rome, parts of northern Spain, so a really big territory. Charlemagne was an amazing person. Supposedly, he himself was illiterate, but he wanted his kingdom to hold together in as many ways as possible. So he really worked to increase literacy. This is when they adopt a new type of alphabet called the Carolingian minuscule. They introduce punctuation, all this good stuff. At this time, the Catholic Church is the big church in Western Europe, and they're all singing the same texts, but in different parts of Europe, they're singing different melodies. So they're singing the same text for the Gloria, maybe in England sounds different than it does in France, which sounds different than it does in Milan, which sounds different than it does in Spain. Charlemagne and his advisors noticed all of this. He traveled, he went to Rome. And I use a silly term. I say he decided that the kingdom that sings together clings together. Now, I totally made that up, but nonetheless, he wanted everyone, just as he wanted them reading the same things and learning how to write and using the same punctuation, he wanted them all singing the same melodies. And how were they going to do this? Well, they imported some singers from Rome to help teach the melodies because they thought Rome, that's the center of the sacred universe. Of course, they'll have the right melodies and all that. But they also thought, you know what we could really use? We could use a way to write this stuff down. Because before that, it was all memorized. We have some notation from ancient Greece, but we can't really read it. So they decided we need to write things down, and they came up with a system in the 9th century, as you said, and started writing down all this massive body of plain chant that everyone was singing. And once you have this written down, you have it codified, you can start to play with it. And that's basically what people did. The instant it was written down, they started changing it and having fun with it and doing exciting things with it, because that's just the nature of creative humans. That's what people do. And
so we begin to write things down in the 9th century. What happens during the Middle Ages that perhaps gets us to what would then be the next big period? What are the changes that once we're able to write it down, what do people do with it?
Well, they do several things. One of the very first things they do was they said, wow, here's this beautiful melody. Let's have more than one melody going on at the same time. So they have what we call polyphony, many sounds from the Greek. At first, it was very, very, very simple. They would simply take the melodic line and they'd have everyone sing exactly the same melodic line, either a fifth or a fourth above that. And I would try to do it with you, except that would make our audio cut out if we tried to sing at the same time. So we won't do that. So they started very simply, everyone moving along the same time. And simple is good until it's you want to do something more. So then they started saying, well, why don't we have one voice maybe holding a long note and the other voice doing some sort of intricate melody on top of that? And they began adding more voices. And then they said, well, how are we going to get all these voices to work together? And they said, you know what we need to do? We figured out how to write down melody. We need to figure out how to write down rhythm. So they begin to come up with rhythmic notation. So first we have melodic notation, but if you're going to coordinate all these different people, you have to have everyone moving at the same speed. So then they invent rhythmic notation, and they're expanding the number of voices. So all of this means more things to play with for the creative mind.
So this is clearly, we're in very exciting territory for music already at this point. We have melody and rhythm, which are very important. But then the next big development in Western European history is the Renaissance, a period which roughly covers about 1400 to 1600. And it has a profound effect on musical composition. We begin to get composers like Guillaume Dufay and Palestrina working within an established tradition. What would you say are the hallmarks of music during the Renaissance?
Well, I always like to say it's like the development of American cars. Bigger, faster, louder. So what you get, instead of having maybe 3 different musical parts, you start having 4 different musical parts, or 5, or 6, or 7, or 8. So Seraphic Fire is going to be performing some 8-voice polyphony from the 16th century, which by that time wasn't anything special. I mean, it was wonderful, but lots of people were writing for 8 voices. So they increased the number of voices. At the same time, they're increasing the range of the vocal parts. So instead of having everything fit nicely in probably what we would think of as the tenor range, they start to develop a real bass range. They start going down quite low. And at the same time, they start experimenting into higher voices, whether that's with castrati or with boys for the high parts, because women aren't allowed to sing in the Catholic Church. So the number of voices is increasing, the range is increasing, and also the complexity of the way the music is put together. We have what we call imitation. I think most people think of a really simple example is something like a canon, like Row, Row, Row Your Boat, or Frere Jacques, where one person sings a melody and someone comes in a little bit later singing the same melody and someone comes in a little bit later. That's imitation. That's actually strict imitation. So they start building these beautiful, complex pieces where one voice after another is answering in these little imitative modules. And it's a very different texture than what we've had before. So the combination, that the more voices, the bigger range, and this rich imitative texture is just, it goes into what we call the golden age of polyphony, with all this wonderful, wonderful 16th century Palestrina, Victoria, Morales, Guerrero, all these great, great people, just gorgeous stuff.
So, and we'll be performing a number of those pieces, some from the beginning. Nuper Rosarum Flores by Guillaume Dufay, which is one of the seminal works of the 15th century. It dedicated to the Florentine Duomo. The multi-voice piece that you're talking about is Tomás Luis de Victoria, his double choir setting of the Alma Redemptoris Mater, which alternates back between two choirs. He was a student of Palestrina, and he sort of continues that, but in a more complex way. But once we get to the beginning of the 17th century, we observe new developments in music, particularly the establishment of a hierarchy of melodic, harmonic, and accompanimental lines, rather than the equality of music voices in Renaissance polyphony. This is seen perhaps most dramatically in the work of the late 16th and early 17th century composer Claudio Monteverdi, but he's not the only one. Could you explain a little to us about the paradigm shift that happens here that leads us into the music of what we'd call the Baroque period?
Well, there's several things going on. As you say, there's now a hierarchy. People are very, very interested in the melodic line and the bass line, the supporting bass line. And what happens in between is not quite as much of not quite as much concern as it had been in the Renaissance. What makes this possible is the development of what we call tonality, major keys, minor keys, piling up chords, different types of chords, and the relationships that the chords have to each other. So what a Baroque composer would do would be to write a beautiful melodic line and write a bass line, and then give indications over the bass line as to what chords the people playing the bass line should play. The bass line would be played by some type of chordal instrument, organ, harpsichord. It could be a harp, it could be a lute, something that can realize chords. It didn't matter exactly how it was put together, whether you had 1-3-5 or 3-5-1 or whatever. There was a lot of variety that the people playing this bass line could have. The melody was exciting, the bass line was exciting. What went on in between, there was just much more freedom for that. And at the same time, what's happening at the same time is we have the invention of opera. And opera is the idea of a sung piece of music. Well, as we know, goes back to the Middle Ages. Hildegard's Ordo Virtutum is a dramatic piece of music. It's a drama that is sung throughout. But it really takes off around 1600. And suddenly there's this incredible interest in how can we make music as crazy dramatic as possible. And so it wasn't just the idea of having, I keep using the term dramatic, but it's the one that comes to mind. It isn't just for opera. They want church music to be dramatic. They want chamber music to be dramatic. They want all music to have these extremes of passion. And this is when we have the beginning of dynamics written down. People must have used dynamics before 1600, but now the composer is saying, I want this to be loud. I want this to be soft. So all of these things combined, the drama, this emphasis on the top line and the bass line, and the freedom of embellishment and chordal accompaniment, all of that is going on to make 17th century music sound really different, wonderful, just like Renaissance music is wonderful, but it very different, sounds very different.
Yeah, very different. And we continue to have that sort of that interaction between equal voices, but it becomes more formalized as like a Baroque counterpoint, like we hear in Bach. But it still sort of harkens back a little bit to the complexity of the Renaissance. But once we reach the middle of the 18th century, there are some enormous shifts going on in the socio-political life of Western Europe. the most consequential of which being the development and promulgation of the philosophy of the European Enlightenment. So political power, which had already been trending in this direction, makes a dramatic shift away from religious to temporal power. Enlightened monarchs, and enlightened probably in quotes at this point, seeing themselves as inheritors of the tradition of classical Greece and Rome, cultivate artistic sensibilities that emphasize form, symmetry, and simplicity, and music begins to follow suit, I think. Is this the case?
Yes, I would agree with that. It is very interesting because at various times during the history of the West, people have looked back to ancient Greece and Rome as models for behavior, for literature, for architecture, for art. And as I said at the beginning, we have almost nothing left in terms of music from ancient Greece or ancient Rome. So when composers are looking back at that, they choose what to borrow from that. And as you were saying, symmetry, elegance, simplicity, those are the things that they do. So we will now have melodic lines that have very clear balanced phrases, 4 measures followed by another 4 measures, that little antecedent, consequent, or arch melodies, something very elegant, simple, plain, clear. The textures get much thinner. As you were saying, we certainly have Baroque counterpoint, J.S. Bach, so on and so forth. But by the time we get to the late 18th century, there's much less use of that. Something that I always find very interesting is in the Baroque, they're exploring all the different keys, all major keys, all minor keys. And I think it's because they've just discovered tonality, major and minor, and they're all over the place. The classical period in the late 18th century, for whatever reason, is overwhelmingly interested in keys in major, C major, D major, G major. Pieces in minor, which are, bum, 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 much sadder to us. They're much fewer. There are far fewer of those than there are of major. I'm not sure why, but I do think it's sort of a classicizing, let's be elegant, let's not be dramatic, let's not be Dionysian, let's not all get drunk, let's all be Apollonian and very, very thoughtful. But I do want to throw in one sort of not so great thing about the Enlightenment, which is, of course, it led into the French Revolution, which meant that there were a lot of ways in which composers and musicians earned their living before that time, which was basically as being employed by the church or being employed by a wealthy noble person or king or prince or duke or something like that. That it didn't disappear completely, but they no longer were usually able to offer that kind of employment opportunity. So that's one of the down things for musicians. Fewer gigs, as it were. So all good stuff. And ultimately, of course, the equality of all humans, very important. And the idea of rationality as being significant for ordering the political structure. But employment opportunities for musicians, some disappeared because of the Enlightenment, alas.
Yes. I mean, so we could talk a little bit more about classical music. And one of the pieces that we're performing in a few weeks when we perform this concert is Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus, which is in D major. All the voices sing the same words at the same time. You can hear exactly what is being communicated. There is one specific affect at a time. We don't have multiple, and when we do have some counterpoint, it's one thing against one other thing. And I always found it interesting that when Mozart and Haydn and even Beethoven would have been asked who is the composer that they admired the most, it wouldn't have been Bach, because Bach was just a church musician. Bach is a creation of the Romantic era. It really would have been Handel. And the piece that they would have known more than anything would have been Messiah. And the piece that they knew more than is the Hallelujah Chorus and Ave Verum Corpus. And the Hallelujah Chorus are in the same key. They reference each other. And we have things like Haydn's Creation or the Ninth Symphony, which use these late Baroque ideas to create this classical sound. I mean, am I out of my mind here, or is this? I mean,
no, I don't think so at all. I mean, certainly Handel's importance. I think today musicians probably know Bach more than Handel, but that certainly wasn't true in the later part of the 18th century or into the early part of the 19th century. And precisely because of Handel's choruses, his oratorios, Messiah most of all, but also Judas Maccabeus and a few others as well, they inspired Haydn to write the Creation and the Seasons, which were wildly, wildly popular. And they inspired Mendelssohn to write Paul and Elijah, which were wildly, wildly popular. So it's really choral music that brings the Baroque through the classical period into the 19th century because of these things that are fantastic to sing, absolutely fantastic to sing.
Sure, sure. I mean, just one more, and since, we can sort of jazz on Handel just a little bit more. I mean, you think about Beethoven and why he idolized Handel so much. And I think one of the other reasons may have been sort of related to your idea about the French Revolution, which is that Handel, while he certainly was patronized at times by kings and by princes or by the church, he himself was a fabulously successful entrepreneur. He was the Andrew Lloyd Webber of his time. He was rich as Croesus and also could write whatever he wanted to. And so in addition to idolizing the music that he wrote, they idolized sort of the freedom of creativity and lifestyle that he had. So let me sort of put a warning label on this talk for right now. Because I think we've been talking very specifically so far about periods of music history as if they were distinct. But that really is only something that we've placed upon the history of music retrospectively. In fact, one of the pieces on our upcoming program is particularly unclassifiable. Gregorio Allegri's Miserere was composed in a distinctly 16th century Renaissance style during the 17th century when the Baroque style was already coming into fashion, but it has a life beyond there, especially through the composers Mozart and Mendelssohn. So can you talk to us a little bit about the sense of mystery and even romanticism that surrounds the Allegri Miserere?
That's a great, it's a wonderful piece that I think almost everyone just adores. I'm going to start back with, I'm always telling my students, people did not wake up on January 1st, 1600 and say, hey, it's the Baroque. The style changes slowly and at different paces. And yes, there are sometimes very key things that sort of shake up the musical world, Rite of Spring by, Stravinsky in the early 20th century and so on and so forth. But there is almost always some sort of continuity. As you were saying, people are still writing counterpoint in the Baroque. People are still using Renaissance ideas throughout the Baroque. So the Miserere is an incredible piece because there are all these terrific myths around it. And there's nothing that people like more than a myth. There's a teeny bit of truth to the myth in that the Miserere was always sung by the papal choir during Holy Week. So that makes it a special thing. It's not as if they're performing this every Sunday or anything like that. It's only done at a certain specific time during the year. The sort of the myth is that, and then no one wasn't allowed to be shared and so on and so forth. And that Mozart, who toured Italy with his father when he was a young man, heard it and wrote it down after one hearing, which being Mozart, he probably could. And so then the secret was broken, blah, blah, blah. Well, probably not. The way that the piece worked is that, as you said, it starts out with a very simple, clear Renaissance style, even though it's written in the early Baroque, because often with church music, when they weren't trying to make it sound like opera, they were trying to make it sound like good old-fashioned Palestrina or something like that. And it was a type of music that often involved improvisation. And what happened was some of the improvised parts of it got written down. And as you know, improvisation is constantly changing. So there are actually multiple versions of this piece that keep changing over the decades and eventually over the centuries. I think people like the version that people hear now, and I think is the one that you're performing, is one that seems to be a mixture of a variety of different versions that go back to the 18th century, but maybe even have a little 20th century going on in there. I think what people love, well, it's a very simple construction in that we have these big repeated sections. We have two different choruses. So of course that's inherently dramatic. That's very Baroque, although that actually goes back to the Renaissance. But what we also have is this beautiful high soprano soaring over this, up to this high C. And I know your singers carry this off like, it sounds like heaven has opened up and a little angel is letting in the truth of the divine to us. So even though what you are performing almost certain, in fact, we can guarantee does not sound like exactly like what Allegri wrote in the 17th century, it is nonetheless a beautiful and beloved piece, but also shows how music is constantly evolving and how we look to the past. We shape the past for what we want in our present day. And going back just a little bit, Mozart revised Messiah. Messiah doesn't use flutes, well, that's old fashioned by the time you get to 1786. So I love the fact that composers have not felt like the past is hands off. We can't touch the past. We want to try to do things sometimes like it was done in the past because it can open our ears in different ways and it can generate new types of beauty. But the past is there for us today. And the Allegri Miserere is a great example of how the past has flourished into the future.
I'd like to mention first that much of this music is in the playlist that is on the website for this program. If you'd like to listen to any of this music, if things we are mentioning that you've never heard of before, they are almost certainly on the Spotify playlist that is on the homepage for this concert. Also, before I get to the next question, I'd like to mention that it looks like we will have a little time for questions at the end of the formal part of our program. I have about 2 questions left. So if you'd like to ask a question to Honey, please send your questions to Alexis Aimee through the chat feature, and we'll be able to recognize a few of you to pose your question. If you would, at the end of your question, put either yes or no, which is the answer to the question, I would like to pose this question myself. If you say yes, we will recognize you and you can ask it directly to Honey. If the answer is no, I will read it off for you. So up to you. But let's move on to the 19th century. So the Romantic period in music, starting somewhere at the beginning of the 19th century-ish, somewhere around Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, probably, is characterized by a number of expansions in form and emotion from the classical period. It's like history is repeating itself. But it also saw a large expansion of music as an amateur pursuit of the growing middle class, a result of the Enlightenment. So how does that affect the development of musical composition and distribution?
Well, one of the things I love about what happens in the Romantic period in terms of social changes is that we women get to sing a lot of this music that we didn't get to in the past, because church music in general was restricted to male voices, so either adult males or choir boys. Handel's Messiah was performed, its first versions were all performed by male altos. And only when we get to later in the 18th century and into the 19th century do women get to sing as well. So I'm a huge fan of the fact that there's a lot more freedom now, a lot more equality, a lot more opportunity for all voices and not just for male voices. That's one terrific thing that happens during this time. The popularity of choral music going back to Handel, to Handel and Messiah. Already by the time Handel, when they were celebrating the 100th anniversary of his birth, they started doing these massive performances of Messiah that had hundreds and hundreds of musicians, both singers and orchestral members. And they kept doing that. And so the opportunity to sing these things, and then of course to sing the two Haydn oratorios I mentioned, the Mendelssohn oratorios, more and more middle-class people were involved in singing, but not just middle-class people, because there was a sense that, you know what, choral music is good for people. And in the latter half of the 19th century, starting about the mid-19th century and into the latter half, they would start choruses specifically for working people, people who were lorry drivers or bakers or carpenters or something like that, because they thought this is a really great thing for people to have this opportunity. So you have so many more people who can sing now, the middle class, the working class, women. And as a result, you get publishers who say, okay, what we need now are inexpensive, what we call choral octavos, these fairly small pieces of sheet music or pieces of choral music that aren't very expensive, that people can buy for themselves, or choruses can buy a bunch. And this is a huge change from everything that happened in before that, where almost everything was in manuscript, copied in manuscript, and you'd have hand copies. So the 19th century is a massive opening up of opportunity for choral music in just a gazillion different ways. And for that, I'm just so grateful to the Enlightenment and to the thought that the recognition, which you well know, that singing choral music is such an amazing opportunity for everyone. And as William Byrd said, since singing is so good a thing, I wish all men could learn to sing. And of course, all people could learn to sing is how we would do it today. Such a great, great opportunity, which still exists today.
Absolutely. I mean, the two pieces that we are performing from the Romantic period, one is a piece by Felix Mendelssohn, Laudate Pueri Dominum, which is written for three pieces for Frauenchor, for women's chorus, which is like a completely different idea at this point. And then a piece by Samuel Coleridge Taylor, a Black man who is writing a very dramatic a cappella work, which would have been sung by probably an amateur choral society, something that would have been fun, and that the people both singing it and who are in the audience would have found it quite fantastical. So the Romantic period really does open up music even more to all people at that point. Now, when we talk about European music moving into the modern and now contemporary periods, the events that are the most consequential are the two extraordinarily deadly and destructive world wars of the first half of the 20th century, and the migration of a considerable population of European immigrants from Europe to North America, specifically the United States. So, honey, this is the $1 million question. We're here at the end of Name That Tune, and here's the hard one, which is, what happens as what was thought of as a genteel, unifying European form runs headfirst into socio-political chaos and encounters the less hierarchical approach to culture of America?
Well, when I tell my students about the 20th century, what I like to say is we get to a century where anything goes, and anything and everything goes. One of the if you want to find a silver lining in these horrible, horrible wars that happened, it was that a huge number of incredibly talented musicians from Europe fled Europe and came to the United States, which was this wonderful, wonderful infusion of talent and expertise and passion into the American musical scene, which prior to the 20th century had sort of an inferiority complex. Maybe that would be one way of putting it. What also happens is, of course, America has an incredibly rich popular music tradition, going back to shape note singing and spirituals and jazz and gospel, and so all these wonderful, wonderful traditions that approach music in a different way. So in some ways you get a blending of popular and art music together. You get much more, I would say, openness to all sorts of different sounds. I think you've spoken sometimes about some of the people you have commissioned for pieces for Seraphic Fire that just bring this fresh imagination and this incredible openness to, what sounds good. At the same time, what you also get, once again, people looking to the past, people looking to the Renaissance, to Gregorian chant, to all of that, and incorporating that in their music as well, which you, in one of the commission pieces, I believe, that you're performing, is built on using the same text as the Alma Redemptoris Mater chant, and using some textures from the Renaissance. I like to think of part of this as the fact that suddenly people are teaching music history in schools. And so your trained composer is now learning not just what is being heard on the radio, but music from the past to the beginning. And it's this massive toolkit that they can choose from. And we didn't really talk about it as we were going along, but many of the pieces that you're performing are built on earlier pieces of music. The Dufay Nuper Rosarum Flores is built on 2 pieces of plain chant. The Victoria motet that you're doing, again and again, composers look to the past and say, wow, that's great. Now what can I do with it? Now how can I change it? And that's exactly what people are still doing today.
Yeah, this entire program actually is built on that first piece of plain chant, Alma Redemptoris Mater, which we've recorded and which we'll sing at the beginning of the program, but is sort of paraphrased by Tomás Luis de Victoria. And then Cecilia McDowell sets it, very bits of the Alma. But we also find quotes from the Alma in Hildegard's Ordo Virtutum. And so like this tune has been around for almost probably 1,000 years at least, and yet it's still being composed upon and runs through all of this music that we will be performing over the course of basically 70 minutes. I mean, it's the McNuggets version of music history, your greatest sort of choral hits. So we have some questions from the chat. And Jordan Sains has actually 2 great questions, and which I think actually looking at them next to each other actually relate to each other. So Jordan, I wonder if you would ask both of your questions at the same time to us.
Got you. Well, first, I want to say I'm a huge fan of Seraphic Fire, bigger fan than Honey. And my 2 questions. The first one is about Hildegard, and it's about why she wrote her music and just the reason why she was popularized. And also the second question was, why did things get dramatized throughout opera and Baroque? Like the American Cars, why did opera and Baroque become the bigger, faster, louder?
Great questions. So I'll start with Hildegard. Hildegard, if you know a little bit about Hildegard, you know that she is a saint, and she is what's called a doctor of the church. She's a theologian, and her music, which as musicians we love, is simply part of her massive worldview of how God loves the world, how we interact with the world, is our position in the world, and so on and so forth. So she's very much a holistic creator. So her music reflects her theological statements. She saw vision. She was a visionary, and she wrote books explaining these. And so the music goes hand in hand with everything that she was doing with the rest of her life. She would never have thought of herself as a composer. In fact, the word composer didn't even really exist in the Middle Ages. As she saw it, the Holy Spirit was speaking through her and sending her these melodies and these words to write down. So she never would have said, oh, here's a piece I wrote. She would say, the Holy Spirit gave me this song. So that's in a sense why she is writing things down. She also feels as if, we know from her statements, that God wants her to write this down, because for the first 40 years of her life, she got vision after vision after vision, but she pretty much kept them to herself because, well, most people don't see visions. And then when she was 42 years old, she had a vision from God saying, you need to write this stuff down. So that's the main reason why she went ahead and did this. So in terms of why this is popular, there's several reasons. I know her music appeals to people who are devout Catholics, who believe implicitly in Hildegard's theology, and I know it also appeals to people who are agnostics or atheists. The music itself is so beautiful, and the overwhelming message, which is about love, is one that can appeal to everyone. So I think that's the basic reason why the music is appealing to people. I think people got interested because, wow, she's a woman composer. We don't know so many of those. But they wouldn't have kept listening if they didn't think this music was really terrific music. So that's, I think, the reason for that. In terms of opera, I like to think, just as the impulse to sing is, I think, a universal impulse, I think that the impulse to put on a play is universal as well. In fact, I think back to Hildegard's convent, as if Hildegard is going to her people and saying, let's put on a play. I mean, it didn't happen that way, but in the sense of, let's put on costumes, let's dramatize something, we have something to show for people. And as a musician, I think anything with music is better than anything without music. There may be some drama people in the audience, so I don't mean to insult you, but music makes almost everything better, I think. So I think that is, again, something that has helped pull this together. Now, I should say that some of you may be aware of the fact that Monteverdi wrote an opera called Orfeo in 1607, which was not the first opera. There's several operas before that. But Monteverdi is such a brilliant composer, and the music is so terrific that I really think that was the one that made people think, wow, this is actually really cool stuff. So it's a little difficult to tell exactly why something took off. But again, I think that universal desire to watch a play or to listen to a play with music is just incredibly appealing. Think today how opera is still very popular. Musical theater is incredibly popular. The idea of let's pretend to be something else, or let's watch other people pretending to be something else and singing cool songs while they're at it. I don't think that's ever going to go away.
That's a great question, Jordan. Thank you for that. So, honey, we have a question from Nirupa Chowdhury, who has a really a fascinating question, which is: did composers go back and transcribe older music to utilize the range of adult women's voices once women were allowed to sing in public?
Wow, that's a great question. It is certainly true that throughout history, composers in a given era have copied over music from the past, even music that's published, because when you copy music, you learn more about it than you do simply by looking at music. Having said that, off the top of my head, I can't think of an example where a composer said, let's look at this and rewrite it so that women can sing it. But it's certainly true that women started singing pieces that had previously been sung by men. And there are certainly professional, well, for example, Patrick, when you are singing Victoria, that was not written for women. And you are having women sing it. And different choir directors sometimes will take a piece and either, especially an a cappella piece, either sing it a little higher or a little lower, depending upon the voices you have at your disposal. So that's certainly something that has gone on with that. I'm not sure if that answers your question exactly, and I'm not sure if people said, wow, women can sing now, except for women who are saying, yes, we can sing now.
Well, I mean, I think what you do bring up a very good point, which is that Seraphic Fire is a mixed voice ensemble, and we sing primarily music that was never intended, in the larger sense, to be sung by women. Actually, every piece on this program, except for perhaps the chant, before the Mendelssohn piece, was written for only men's voices. And so most of it came at a time when boys were singing the top line, but there are definitely pieces that we are singing, like Nuper Rosarum Flores, or some of the music from the Stella Splendens that we're singing from the Libre de Vermel, the medieval piece, that we're choosing the key that we're going to be performing in. For people like Victoria, who wrote a piece, he didn't actually intend it to be F major, even though it's written in with one flat in the key signature. It just showed where, in general, the music was to be pitched. It probably would have been different in every town because every town's major organ was tuned to a different pitch. So the answer is yes, no, maybe, and all of the above to that question. We have a question from Beth Braswell, and I'll ask it for you first, and then I will also answer it. But Beth asks, what piece of music from the show are you most looking forward to performing? And maybe, Honey, you could say, as a fan of Seraphic Fire, of the pieces because you've written about all of these pieces at this point, which of the pieces are the ones that you would be looking for the most to hear Seraphic Fire sing?
Oh boy, I mean, you guys do everything so beautifully, but I will say I don't really know. There are a few pieces that I don't know as well, which means I'm always the Coleridge Taylor piece. I don't really know. And that is everything I've heard. He's being performed more and more these days. And everything I've heard suggests, I keep thinking, oh, that's a good piece. Oh, that's a good piece. So that probably is the one I'm most curious about. And I don't think there are any recordings of it that I know of.
I think that there may be one recording of it on YouTube. And when we first performed it about 2 years ago, on a program of the Madrigals of Love and War, where we juxtaposed the music of Monteverdi with 19th and 20th century composers, we sang this for the first time, and there was no recording at that time. And we sang it, and not only did the chorus, did it blow our minds, but it was by far one of the most popular pieces on that program. And so we're really, really excited that this concert gives us a chance to repeat it. I will say that for me, all of it is amazing music. There is no piece really more fun to sing than Bach's Lobet den Herrn, which will be wonderful. But the piece that I think that I have missed the most from this Seraphic Fire repertoire that we have sung before, that we are singing again on this piece, is Dufay's Nuper Rosarum Flores, which is a piece that, Dufay was such an important composer even during his lifetime. He was valued so much that when the plague came to Europe, he was spirited away so as not to be affected by the plague. He was taken away because he was thought of as a treasure too priceless to lose to the plague. So he writes this piece, Nuper Rosarum Flores, for the dedication of the Florentine Duomo, the Florentine cathedral, which many of you have been to, and has this really incredible dome. The Duomo itself is built to the specifications of the Ark of the Covenant, which is also to the specifications of Noah's Ark. And Dufay puts all of that numerology into Nuper Rosarum Flores and makes it sound like one of the most spectacular aural experiences of one's lifetime. It starts out with two voices in unison and ends with this most remarkable, gigantic chord, and it's in 4 parts. And it is a ravishing piece of music. The concert, we have a question where someone asks if this concert will be recorded and available for those unable to attend. This is a great question to ask right now, because we used to record and put out all of our programs on video. This year, the state of Florida, after our budget season started, cut $150,000 from our budget. It actually cut 600 different cultural organizations. We were ranked number 18 out of 650. We're supposed to get $150,000, and we cut it out. And so we've actually had to cut out a good bit of our recording as a result. But we will record it for archival purposes. But we're still trying to figure out if we can fundraise to find the money for the video. So if anyone on this call wants to make sure that this is available for the ages, please feel free to send an email to me at patrick@seraphicfire.org, and I can definitely tell you how to do that. I don't think that there are any other questions. I want to say that, honey, it is always so wonderful to see you. And I feel like every time I ask a question, I learn like 7 new things in addition to prompting the answer that like we had sort of agreed upon. So I just want to say thank you, and thank you for being part of Seraphic Fire's life and for helping curate this season of your colleagues. I wonder if you might just say just a tiny bit about some of the people who are coming on, just in terms of, do you like them? Are they interesting? Have they written interesting things? Maybe you could just speak a little bit about the other folks like you who are coming to talk.
Sure. I know 3 of them personally. I know 2 of them personally. I have read a book of a third person, and there's one person I don't actually know. Craig Monson is going to be talking about nuns and women and Baroque women and so on and so forth. He is an amazing scholar who's one of the first people really to look at nun musicians. And he's written a whole series of books that are specifically intended for people who are not musicologists, for people who like music and are curious about things. His first book is called Nuns Behaving Badly, which, talk about an amazing title. But nuns, just because they took vows, didn't always follow these vows. So he's done all sorts of archival work about what nuns were really like. So he's pretty amazing in that respect. Andy Weaver is a wonderful scholar who covers so many different things. He has written about Renaissance music. He's a specialist in Baroque music, but he's also written about Schumann and Richard Strauss, and you name it, he's written about it. So he's going to be the romantic one for your romantic program, if I'm remembering this correctly. Andy Weaver for romance.
Yes, absolutely.
And then let's see.
Rebecca Sipus.
Rebecca Sipus is such an interesting person. She is also a performer herself. She has written a lot about, she wrote a wonderful book about women and musical salon. Back in the 18th century, women had sometimes restricted opportunities in terms of participating in public life. So what many of them would do would be to start a sort of a private salon, where, however, leading thinkers, philosophers, artists, musicians would get together to come, to talk, to eat, to play music. And this was a great place for women to play their own musical compositions and for women to perform, because if you were a woman of a certain social class, it was not considered a good thing to perform in public. So she's written a wonderful book about that. And so she'll be talking about on your 18th century concert for that one. So those are the 3 I know, and they're all wonderful, wonderful scholars. And I think that it should be really interesting conversations with them.
Yes, and our next program will actually be Mark Kligman, who runs the Milken Archive of Jewish Music at UCLA, and he'll be interviewed by our associate conductor that I think everyone on this call knows, James Bass. And so we're really looking forward to that too. So thank you to all of you who are in our audience tonight. This is the first of 6 online lectures that we'll be hosting. And if you like it, I hope you'll tell your friends. And if you don't, please tell your enemies. We're at the end of our time, but I'd like to make sure that everyone on this video conversation listening to this podcast knows that our next Seraphic Fire program, A Brief History of Western Music, will run October 10th through 13th with performances in Miami, Coral Gables, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach. And you can find more about these online at seraphicfire.org. A special thank you to our guest collaborating scholar, Honey Meconi, for such an amazing and engaging talk this evening. It really makes me excited to start rehearsals in about a week or so. And thank you to all of you. And I look forward to seeing you at our upcoming show. Thanks so much, and see you in person very soon.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.